There is a phone call that happened at midnight in 1972. James Brown, the hardest working man in show business, the godfather of soul, a man who had performed over 300 shows in a single year, called his music producer, woke him from a dead sleep, and said 4 words. "We have to start over." The producer thought he was talking about a single track. He wasn't. He was talking about the entire album. And the reason James Brown made that call, the thing that happened earlier that night that made him feel like everything he had ever done was not quite enough, had nothing to do with music. It had everything to do with a party in Los Angeles. And a man named Bruce Lee. Now, before I tell you what happened at that party, I need you to understand something about James Brown in 1972. Because if you don't understand who James Brown was at that specific moment in his life, you will not feel the full weight of what happened that night. By 1972, James Brown was not just a musician. He was a phenomenon. He had been performing since he was a teenager. 20 years on stage. 20 years of shows that left audiences destroyed. Screaming, crying, on their feet for hours. 20 years of a physical performance style so demanding, so precise, so relentlessly disciplined that his band members operated under a system of fines. Miss a note, you were fined. Show up late, fined. Wear the wrong shoes on stage, fined. One musician who played in his band for 4 years said that rehearsing with James Brown was more physically grueling than any sport he had ever played. They would run the same 8-bar section 40, 50, 60 times. Not because it was wrong, but because James Brown could feel the difference between 97% and 100%, and 97% was not acceptable. He did not accept it from his musicians. He absolutely did not accept it from himself. Stories from people who watched him prepare for shows describe a man who treated his own body like an instrument that required constant tuning. He stretched before every performance. He studied footage of himself after every show, not to enjoy it, but to find the moments where the movement had been a fraction too slow, a fraction too loose, a fraction too far from the ideal he was chasing. James Brown was obsessed with one thing above everything else. Control. The control of his body. The control of every movement, every step, every gesture, the exact angle of his arm when he pointed at the audience, the exact millisecond he dropped to his knees during a song. He had rehearsed these things thousands of times. He had built a physical language so precise that other performers studied it the way music students study Bach. He believed, genuinely, deeply believed, that he had mastered the relationship between a human body and the space it moved through. He had spent 20 years earning the right to believe that. And then he walked into a party in Los Angeles. And he saw Bruce Lee standing across the room. The party was at a house in the Hollywood Hills. One of those gatherings where the guest list reads like a fever dream. Musicians, directors, athletes, actors, people whose names you know from very different contexts, all in the same room at the same time. Bruce Lee was there because he was, by the middle of 1972, impossible to ignore. Enter the Dragon was still in post-production. He had not yet become the global icon he would be within a year. But in Los Angeles, in those rooms, people already knew. They had seen him on the Green Hornet. They had heard stories from people who had trained with him or watched him train. They had seen the way other martial artists, serious ones, men with decades of experience, talked about him with a particular kind of hushed reverence that you don't fake. James Brown arrived at the party late. He arrived the way James Brown always arrived, with presence, with intention, with the quiet certainty of a man who knows exactly what kind of energy he carries into a room. He did not know Bruce Lee was going to be there. He saw him from across the room before anyone introduced them. And he stopped walking. Later, much later, Brown would try to describe what he noticed in that first moment. He said it wasn't the way Bruce Lee looked. It wasn't the size of him or the way he was standing or anything you could point to and say, there, that's the thing. It was something underneath all of that. Something in the quality of the stillness. He said Bruce Lee, standing completely still at a party, holding a drink, saying something to the person next to him, looked more physically alive than anyone else in the room. Like every cell in his body was awake at the same time. They were introduced an hour later. The conversation, by all accounts, started simply. Two men who had heard of each other. Polite curiosity. The kind of small talk that happens when two people are both trying to figure out if the other one is real or just the version of themselves they perform for rooms like this. And then someone nobody remembers who asked Bruce Lee to show something. It was the kind of request that happens at parties like that. Casual. Half joking. The way you might ask a musician to play something or an athlete to demonstrate a throw. Bruce Lee could have declined. He often did in certain company in certain moods. He didn't decline that night. He set down his drink. He asked for a small amount of space. And for the next 4 minutes, James Brown would later say it felt like much longer. Bruce Lee moved. Not fighting. Not sparring. Not any kind of formal demonstration. Just movement. Pure, unscripted, unrepeated movement through space. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people pretending to pay attention. The real quiet. The kind that happens when a room full of people suddenly forgets, all at the same time, that they were in the middle of conversations. People who were there describe it differently depending on who you ask. One person said it looked like watching water move, continuous without beginning or end, each motion flowing into the next so smoothly that you could not identify the moment one thing became another thing. Another person said it looked almost slow. That was the word they used. Slow. Not because it was slow, it was not slow, but because there was no wasted energy anywhere in it. No preparation, no wind-up, no telegraphing. Just pure intention becoming pure action with nothing in between. A third person, a dancer who had been performing professionally for 15 years, said she felt something she had never felt watching another body move before. She said she felt embarrassed. Not for Bruce Lee. For herself. For every compromise she had ever made between what she was trying to do and what her body had actually done. She said watching him move made her feel, for the first time in her career, like she understood how far she still had to go. That was the room Bruce Lee was standing in when James Brown was watching from the edge of the cleared space. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. Now I want you to think about what it means that James Brown went quiet. This is a man who had stood in front of audiences of 50,000 people and never once lost his composure. A man who had performed through illness, through heartbreak, through the deaths of people he loved. A man who had shared stages with the greatest performers of the 20th century and never, not once, been made to feel like he was watching something he didn't understand. He went quiet. He stood at the edge of the space that had been cleared and he watched Bruce Lee move. And something happened inside him that he would spend months trying to articulate. It wasn't envy. He was clear about that later. It wasn't admiration in the simple sense, the feeling you have when you watch someone do something skillful and you appreciate the skill. It was recognition. The recognition of a master craftsman watching another master craftsman do something in a completely different discipline, and understanding, with sudden and devastating clarity, that they are working from the same source. The same obsession with the relationship between the human body and time. The same absolute refusal to waste a single movement. The same understanding that the space between actions is as important as the actions themselves. James Brown had built his entire career on that understanding. He had thought he was alone in it. He was not alone in it. And the man standing in the middle of that cleared space in the Hollywood Hills, the man who had come from Hong Kong with nothing and had been told his entire life that he was not quite right for America, understood something about the human body that James Brown recognized down to his bones. The demonstration ended. The room exhaled. People started talking again. The party reassembled itself around the moment the way parties do, absorbing what had just happened into the general noise. James Brown did not talk for a while. He stood where he was and thought. Later that night he found Bruce Lee again, in a quieter corner of the house. They talked for close to an hour. Nobody recorded what was said. Nobody was taking notes. But people nearby, people who caught fragments, describe it as one of the most unusual conversations they had ever witnessed. Not because it was dramatic. Not because voices were raised or anything extraordinary was said. Because of the quality of the listening. Two men who were, by any measure, at the absolute peak of their respective crafts. Two men who had earned the right to believe they had figured something out that other people hadn't. Talking to each other not as performers, not as public figures, but as students of the same invisible thing. The thing that makes a body speak without words. The thing that makes an audience stop breathing. The thing that cannot be faked, cannot be taught in a classroom, cannot be explained to someone who has not spent years earning the right to feel it. James Brown left the party at around 11. He was in his car for 20 minutes before he picked up the phone. His producer answered on the fourth ring. Half asleep, confused. James Brown said, "We have to start over." The producer said, "Which track?" James Brown said, "All of it. Everything we recorded. It's not enough yet." There was a long silence on the phone. Then the producer asked what had happened. And James Brown said something that the producer would repeat to interviewers decades later, long after both men had lived full lives and the world had changed completely around them. He said, "I just watched a man be completely free inside his own body. And I realized I'm not there yet. I'm close, but I'm not there yet." The album was rebuilt from the ground up. It was released the following year. It is considered one of the greatest records James Brown ever made. He never publicly credited Bruce Lee. He never told the story in any interview. But the producer told it. Quietly. To people who knew how to listen. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. Here is what stays with me about this story. Bruce Lee died 8 months later. He was 32 years old. He never knew about the phone call. He never knew about the album. He never knew that the thing he did at a party in the Hollywood Hills, casually, without rehearsal, without a stage or an audience or any intention of making an impression, had reached inside one of the greatest performers in American history and rearranged something. He just moved. The way he always moved. The way he had trained himself to move since he was a teenager in Hong Kong. Without performance. Without ego. Without any gap between what he was thinking and what his body was doing. That is the thing that is almost impossible to explain to someone who has never experienced it. The gap. Most people, even very talented, very disciplined people, have a gap. Between the intention and the action. Between the thought and the movement. It is usually tiny. Milliseconds. Invisible to most observers. But James Brown, a man whose entire art was built on the elimination of that gap, saw it immediately. Or rather, he saw the absence of it. Bruce Lee had no gap. He had trained it out of himself over 15 years of obsessive, relentless, joyful work. He had dissolved the distance between mind and body until there was no distance left. And when James Brown saw that, when he recognized it in another human being for the first time in his life, he went home and decided he was not done yet. That is the legacy nobody talks about. Not the films. Not the philosophy. Not the fighting style. The way Bruce Lee moved through a room at a party made one of the greatest artists of the 20th century raise his own standard. And then raise it again.